The letter was already damp around the edges when I found it, curled slightly from the cold mountain air. I stood on my front porch, snow clouds stacked over the ridge, reading the same paragraph again and again, trying to process the threat buried under all the formal language. According to our association, my trees were a hazard, a nuisance, and a violation that needed to be corrected before winter fully set in. The part that froze me more than the air was the line about ongoing daily fines if I did not comply. I caught myself wondering whether they would really push it to $200 a day until every trunk was gone. The ink looked darker against the off-white letterhead, the kind that tries too hard to look official. The board had given me a hard deadline: remove all 6 evergreen trees lining the road before December, or they would exercise their right to levy fines and remediate the issue themselves. It read like a threat, wrapped in legal vocabulary and polite bullet points. A dusting of early snow lay in the yard, just enough to turn the mulch around the trees into a thin white ring. The branches swayed slightly in the cold wind, and I had this surreal moment where it felt like the trees were listening in on my punishment. These evergreens weren't just landscaping to me, they were the frame of my view, the first thing I saw every morning when I opened the blinds to the mountain slope. I knew our association had rules. Every homeowners association does. I had expected the usual: no broken down cars in the driveway, keep the trash bins out of sight, no neon paint on the siding. I had not expected an order to rip out living trees that had been here longer than some of the residents. As I read the letter again, the date at the top, November 10th, jumped out at me. They were giving me less than 3 weeks before December, and it wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum dressed up as compliance guidance. It was on that porch, with the wind cutting through my jacket and the sound of a plow grinding its way up the main road in the distance, that I realized this wasn't just a simple landscaping note. This was the start of a full-blown HOA nightmare, and my evergreens were about to become the excuse for something bigger. I folded the letter carefully instead of crumpling it, because something in the tone told me I might need every single line of it later. I didn't know how yet. But I knew one thing: if they were going to force me into a fight over those trees, I wasn't going to walk into it blind. To understand how I got there, shivering with a violation notice in hand, you have to understand Snowy Mountain HOA itself. When I first moved in 3 years earlier, I thought the name was just marketing. Then I got my first winter. This place sits high enough that storms get caught on the ridge and dump snow in waves, blanketing the cul-de-sac and swallowing the sound of traffic until the neighborhood feels like its own little world. On quiet mornings, you can hear nothing but the soft drip of snow melting off gutters and the muffled thump of plows on the main road. My house is on the outside curve of a bend where the road slopes gently downhill. The 6 evergreens grow on a rise between my driveway and the street, tall enough that their tops brush the second-story windows. They were here long before me. The previous owner told me in a handwritten note left with the keys that he planted them with his kids more than 20 years ago. Every fall, the needles carpet the mulch and the edge of the pavement, but they also break the wind and catch the drifting snow that would otherwise pile against my garage. When I closed on the house, the association handed me a thick white binder: Covenants, Conditions and Rules, updated 2018, along with a welcome letter. The binder felt like overkill at the time. I remember flipping through pages about parking, porch lights, and acceptable fencing while the smell of fresh paint still hung in the foyer. Tucked in the middle was a section labeled Landscape and Vegetation Guidelines, complete with diagrams of trees placed at neat little distances from sidewalks. There was a small line I barely noticed back then about no new trees closer than 10 feet from the curb, adopted after a prior winter's plow issues. I remember skimming it and thinking it didn't apply to me, my trees already existed. I also remember pausing on a separate section in the back of the binder called Maintenance and Damage Reimbursement, Clause 4.7. At the time, the words meant nothing to me. It talked about how the association could be required to reimburse owners for damage caused by the board's own vendors under certain conditions. I filed it away mentally with all the other lawyer stuff and told myself I'd dig into it only if I had to. Snowy Mountain HOA has a board of 5 people. At the center of it all is Ms. L, the board president. She has the polished tone of someone who has run meetings for a living and the kind of smile that always looks like she is assessing something. She likes order. She likes consistency. And she really likes rules. Alongside her is Mr. K, the treasurer, who almost never smiles but always carries a manila folder under his arm whenever I see him at the mailbox cluster. The association also has a favorite vendor, the community landscaper, who won the contract for lawn care, common area maintenance, and, more recently, snow removal on the internal streets. His trucks are everywhere in the warmer months, growling around the corners and blowing leaves in tight lines down the cul-de-sac. The board loves him because he keeps things neat. That phrase shows up in every newsletter. At first, I tried to play along. I returned my architectural control forms on time, painted the front door in one of the pre-approved colors, and hid my trash bins behind the garage line as instructed. The rules felt fussy, but living in a managed community meant compromise. I told myself the trade-off, clean streets, stable property values, and that perfect mountain view, was worth it. The trees were never a problem in those early years. They stood quietly at the edge of my lot, green even when everything else was buried. Birds nested in them. They screened my living room from the glare of headlights when neighbors came home late. In summer, they cast long shadows on the driveway, and the resin smell would thicken in the hot air when the sun hit the bark. The landscaper's crew would trim the lower branches occasionally, but nobody complained. Then last winter came, and with it, the first hint that the association was starting to see my evergreens as something else. It started small, the way most Karen neighbor drama stories do, with a petty complaint that pretends to be about safety. The first sign was a note in the monthly newsletter, buried under reminders about driveway sealing and porch decorations. There was a short paragraph about tree debris on plow routes, and how homeowners should ensure that any vegetation near the road did not shed materials that could impede snow management operations. It didn't mention my name or address, but as I read it at my kitchen table, the morning light bouncing off the snow in the yard, I had a sinking feeling it was aimed straight at my property. A week after that newsletter, I noticed the community landscaper walking the curve of the road in front of my house. He had a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. He wasn't alone, one of the board members from the compliance committee trailed behind him, hands in her coat pockets. They paused near the trees, looked up, pointed to the branches overhanging the street, and wrote things down. I could see their breath in the cold air as they stood there, and even from inside my window with the glass slightly fogged, I could tell they weren't admiring the view. Soon after, I got a friendly reminder email from the management company. It used the same language as the newsletter, but this time it singled out my lot number. It suggested that the evergreens along my front boundary were dropping needles on the road and that these materials might interfere with snowplows and create slippery conditions. They strongly encouraged me to address the issue promptly to avoid further action. The tone was polite, but it felt like when someone tells you this is just a conversation and you know it's not. I walked outside that afternoon and scanned the road myself. Yes, there were needles along the curb. It's what happens when you have trees, they shed. The asphalt was clear where the plow blade scraped it. Nothing looked dangerously slick. The sun had melted most of the earlier snowfall, leaving only thin, icy stripes in the shadows. My trees stood there quietly, the wind threading through their branches with a soft hissing sound. I cleaned up more than usual after that, raking and sweeping the edge of the road even when it seemed pointless. I wanted to show good faith, to prove I wasn't trying to be difficult. But as winter went on and the storms grew heavier, it became obvious that this wasn't about a few scattered needles. When spring arrived, Snowy Mountain HOA held its annual meeting in the community room near the entrance. I went, binder in hand, wanting to be informed. That's when I learned that the board had renewed the landscaper's contract and expanded it to include all internal snowplow services, starting next season. The same vendor who trimmed lawns and manicured shrubs would now be responsible for keeping the steep streets clear when the storms rolled in. It sounded efficient. It also sounded like a conflict waiting to happen for anyone whose trees made his work even the slightest bit harder. The board presentation included a slide about plow route efficiency. Hidden in the bullet points was a line about identifying vegetation encroachments prior to winter 2024. My lot appeared in a blurry aerial image, my trees circling the bend like a green guardrail. The board never said my name, but looking around the room, I could feel people glancing my way, as if the picture had done the pointing for them. The overhead lights hummed faintly, and the projector cast a pale blue glow that made the snow scenes on the screen look colder than they already were. I went home that night with a knot in my stomach. The meeting had been wrapped in the language of community safety and accessibility for emergency vehicles, but it felt like the association was slowly building a case. My trees, the ones that had stood through 2 decades of winters without issue, were becoming the scapegoat for a vendor who wanted a smooth, obstacle-free run for his plows. That was when I first realized there was a deadline coming that I hadn't seen in writing yet, a point where the board would decide that my right to keep what was already on my property mattered less than their need for a picture-perfect, frictionless roadway. When that day came, they weren't just going to ask me nicely. They were going to treat my trees like a problem to be erased and back it up with fines, threats, and legal jargon if I resisted. And tucked inside my binder at home, in that clause I had once brushed past without a second thought, was the one sentence that might give me leverage later, if I was stubborn enough to use it. From that night on, the binder stopped being background clutter on a shelf and started sitting open on my dining table, a permanent part of the landscape between my coffee mug and my laptop. Clause 4.7 stared back at me every time I walked by, a short block of text that talked about damage from association vendors and reimbursement responsibilities. I did not know exactly how it would come into play yet, but I knew in my gut that the landscaper's push to blame my trees for his plow routes was going to cross a line. As spring gave way to summer, our neighborhood did what mountain neighborhoods do. The snow retreated into streaks in the shaded gullies. The air warmed just enough for kids to ride bikes in t-shirts, and the evergreens along my front boundary deepened in color, that rich, dark green that almost glows at the edge of dusk. On the surface, everything looked calm. Underneath, I could feel things shifting. The first formal sign of that shift arrived in June, with a pale envelope labeled "Courtesy Compliance Reminder" tucked into my mailbox between a grocery circular and a utility bill. The paper was thinner than the violation letter that would come later, but the structure was the same. There was a section listing my lot number, another describing the observed issue, and a recommendation that I take corrective action within a certain window. As the ceiling fan hummed above my kitchen table, I read their description of my trees like they were a safety hazard in a factory instead of living things rooted in the same soil as my house. They mentioned needle accumulation along the edge of the pavement and limited plow clearance near the curve. The association encouraged me to work with the community landscaper to develop a mitigation plan. There was no fine attached yet, but the implication was clear: fix this now, or something heavier would follow. At the bottom, in small print, they cited a section of the covenants I had barely noticed before, buried under a stack of other clauses. I called the management office number listed on the letter. I kept my tone calm and explained that the trees had been present long before the 2018 landscape guidelines, that they were not new plantings, and that I already did extra cleanup in winter. The person on the other end said they would note my comments. That was it. No acknowledgement of the grandfathered status. No commitment to review the history. Just a bland assurance that my concerns would be filed away somewhere I could not see. After that, I started noticing small signs that I was being watched more closely. The landscaper's crew would pause a little longer across from my house, leaning on their rakes and looking at the branches that extended over the road. The compliance committee member who lived 2 doors down began timing her afternoon walks so she passed right when I was outside sweeping the curb. She always found something fascinating to look at on the other side of the street, but her head would tilt just enough that I knew she was taking mental notes. By September, the association had transitioned from hints to structure. The board posted a plow route assessment notice on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. It explained that the landscaper would be conducting a formal review of all internal streets before winter. There was a little map with shaded zones, and my curve was circled in red marker. The paper smelled faintly of toner and that weird plasticky note you get from fresh laminated signs. The assessment day was colder than usual for early fall. I watched from my front window as the landscaper and 2 board members walked the street, clipboards in hand. They measured the distance from the curb to my trunks, pointed at the low branches, and took photos of the pavement where old needles had settled into the cracks. I had already swept that week, but no matter how much you clean, a few stray needles always remain. They lingered over those remnants like crime scene technicians cataloging evidence. I knew then that the letter I eventually found on my porch in November was not some sudden reaction. It was the culmination of this slow, methodical build-up. The assessment, the courtesy reminder, the targeted newsletter notes, the meeting slides about plow routes, they were all stepping stones leading to one carefully phrased ultimatum. When the snow clouds rolled back in and the days shortened, the HOA stepped from suggestion into enforcement. That was when concern transformed into orders. The violation letter on my porch that gray November afternoon was thicker than the courtesy reminder, printed on heavier paper. Inside, there was not just a narrative of my supposed infraction, but an attachment, a one-page, tree debris impact summary prepared by the community landscaper. Under the buzz of my dining room light, I spread the pages out across the table like I was examining a case file. The summary featured photos of the curve in front of my house, taken after one of the earlier storms. In every shot, the plow path was visible as a clean stripe cut through the snow. Along the edge were brown needles pushed to the side by the blade, clumped against the curb. The landscaper had circled those piles in red digital ink and labeled them hazardous debris. One picture zoomed in so close you could see individual needles pressed into the slush. The narrative section of the summary claimed that my trees contribute significantly to winter roadway obstruction and increase slip risk for motorists and pedestrians. It recommended removal of all 6 evergreens before December 1st, citing ongoing interference with contracted snow management operations. It read like a report designed to close off alternative options. Trimming was insufficient. Partial removal was non-compliant with safety objectives. Attached to this report was the real hammer, a violation notice labeled Final Notice, Vegetation Encroachment dated November 10th. In plain text, it informed me that failure to remove the trees by the deadline would result in daily fines of up to $200 and potential association-initiated remediation at my expense. They referenced CCR Section 4.3, the section about maintenance of areas adjacent to the roadway. It was the first time I saw an actual number tied to the threat, and it made my chest tighten. This was the moment when the math hit me. $200 a day in fines, plus the cost of removal if they sent the landscaper to do it for me, stacked up fast. In less than a month, I could be staring at thousands of dollars in charges for trees that had been on this property long before the current rules. It stopped feeling like a dispute over safety and started feeling like an HOA revenge story gone sideways, where the people in power realized they could weaponize the rulebook against anyone who pushed back. The notice invited me to a violation hearing before the board to discuss compliance, scheduled for November 20th in the community room. I had 10 days to prepare. That date sat on the page like a ticking clock, a countdown not only to winter but to a decision about whether I would bow to the pressure or fight back and risk the association doubling down. I went back to my binder, this time reading CCR Section 4.3 closely. It talked about keeping vegetation from obstructing sidewalks and roadways, but it also mentioned something interesting: the association's responsibility to maintain certain common areas and easements, and the conditions under which they could enter an owner's property to remedy issues. That language intersected with Clause 4.7, the reimbursement rule for damage caused by the board's own vendors. For the first time, I saw the lines connecting. The hearing felt like an exam I had not chosen to take. I organized everything: the courtesy notice from June, the assessment sign from September, the violation letter, the summary prepared by the landscaper, and my notes about when the trees had been planted. I added a photo of the handwritten note from the previous owner, dated long before the 2018 landscape guidelines. As the baseboard heater clicked on and off, I arranged these items into neat stacks, knowing I was building my own version of a file to counter theirs. The community room on hearing night smelled like coffee and vacuumed carpet, with a faint trace of cold air seeping in each time the door opened. The board sat behind a folding table, paperwork stacked in front of them, name placards printed in blocky letters. The landscaper occupied a chair near the side wall, his branded jacket zipped halfway up like he was both a guest and a witness. A few curious neighbors had drifted in, drawn by the promise of drama, and sat in a loose cluster near the back. The board president opened the meeting in a calm, practiced tone, summarizing the purpose of the hearing. The violation was framed as a matter of community safety, snow access, and consistency with established standards. As she spoke, I noticed a printed agenda on the table, and there, under Item 5, was a line reading, "Vegetation impeding plow routes, Lot 17 review." It was a small piece of evidence, but I locked onto it. Later, that agenda excerpt would become one more piece in the mosaic of proof that this had been in the works for months. The landscaper's summary was presented as fact. According to his report, my trees were the primary source of needle debris along that curve. The board repeated his language about hazardous accumulation and reduced plow efficiency. They never mentioned that every tree-lined street in the neighborhood shed something, or that the plows had always managed to run just fine in past winters. It was easier to act as though my lot was the singular problem. When it was my turn, I stayed focused on what I could prove. I explained that the trees predated the 2018 guidelines, that they had been planted decades ago by the prior owner. I pointed out that the covenants prohibit new trees too close to the curb but do not clearly address existing ones. I mentioned that I regularly cleaned the curb and had even increased my efforts after the courtesy reminder. I held up the photo of the previous owner's note and described when it was written. I also pointed out something subtle in the landscaper's photos. In some of them, the needle piles were actually aligned with the direction of plow travel in a way that suggested the debris had been pushed there, not fallen directly under the trees during the storm. The board listened, but their faces did not change much. The treasurer asked about my willingness to consider alternative solutions, which sounded like a lighter phrasing of the same demand: remove the trees or face consequences. The president repeated that the board had a duty to ensure safe passage for vehicles and pedestrians. Safety is hard to argue against, especially when it is being used as a shield for more aggressive action. By the end of the hearing, it was clear where things stood. The board accepted the landscaper's report, treated my long-standing trees as if they were fresh violations, and left the removal order in place, backed by the threat of $200 daily fines and the possibility of forced remediation. They saw my binder of documents as a complication, not a reason to reconsider. I walked home through the cold, the air stinging my cheeks, and stared up at the dark silhouettes of the evergreens against the sky. If the association wanted to push this into full-blown HOA nightmare territory, I was not going to fight it with emotion alone. I needed my own expert, my own paper trail, and a way to use their own covenants against them. The next morning, with frost still glittering along the railing of my deck, I started researching certified arborists in the region. I wanted someone who was local enough to understand mountain conditions but independent enough to have no ties to our association or its beloved landscaper. The search led me to a small firm that specialized in risk assessments and tree health evaluations for municipalities and private properties. Their website talked about root systems, structural stability, and the value of mature trees in preventing erosion. It felt like the opposite of the landscaper's narrow, convenience-focused view. I gathered my documents again, this time with a different goal. On the table, I laid out the final notice, vegetation encroachment, dated November 10, the board agenda excerpt highlighting item 5 from the hearing night, and the section of CCR section 4.3 they had cited. Next to that, I placed a printout of clause 4.7, with the sentence about reimbursement responsibilities highlighted in yellow. On a separate page, I wrote a short timeline: when the trees were planted, when I moved in, when the new landscape guidelines were adopted, when the courtesy reminder arrived, and when the plow route assessment was posted. When the arborist arrived 2 days later, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air had that brittle quality it gets right before the first real snowstorm. We walked the curve together, tracing the line of the road and the positions of the trunks. I pointed out where the plow passed, the usual direction of travel, and the spots where the landscaper's photos had been taken. The arborist studied the soil, the root flare at the base of the trunks, and the spacing between the trees and the pavement. He squinted up at the branches and then down at the curb, as if mapping the path of every fallen needle in his mind. He explained what he was seeing in calm, precise terms. The trees were mature and well-established, not recent additions. The distance from the trunks to the curb was within what many communities consider acceptable for older plantings, especially in hilly areas where vegetation helps hold slope stability. He pointed out how the trees actually blocked some drifting snow, preventing taller ridges from forming directly in front of my driveway. He noted that while some needles did reach the pavement, they did so in patterns influenced by wind and plow movement, not simply by gravity. Over the course of that walk, my fears started to shift into something else: a sense of footing. The arborist agreed to prepare a written report, complete with dates, measurements, and professional opinion on risk and mitigation. I asked him to address the history of the trees, the concept of grandfathering older plantings, and practical alternatives to removal, such as targeted pruning or adjusted plow routes. He nodded and jotted down notes, marking the tree closest to the bend as number 1 and working his way down the line. I knew this report would cost money, but I also knew it could become a key piece of leverage. In the back of my mind, the words of Clause 4.7 kept echoing. If the association insisted on forcing the landscaper's preferred solution and that solution ended up causing damage or unnecessary expense, that clause could become my path to reimbursement. The idea of turning their own covenants into a shield felt like the first step from defense toward offense. What the board did not realize yet was that their aggressive push to erase my trees had opened a door they did not control. With a neutral arborist's report in hand, I would not only have grounds to challenge their safety narrative, I would also have the ability to line up their own documents, dates, and vendor contracts in front of the community and show exactly how far they were willing to stretch their power to get their way. I was no longer planning just to save my trees. I was planning to make the association explain their choices out loud, in front of the same neighbors they claimed to be protecting. In a place where everyone watches everyone else's compliance, the prospect of public scrutiny has weight. The board had been comfortable making decisions in rooms where the only voices came from behind the table. I intended to bring the conversation into the open, armed with more than just frustration. I would walk into the next round with a professional report, a highlighted clause, and a quiet plan to make their own record work against them. The arborist's report arrived 3 days later as a neatly formatted PDF and a printed copy I asked him to mail. I spread the pages on the same dining table where the association's notices had been laid out, the contrast almost comical. Where the landscaper's summary relied on dramatic photos and loaded phrases, the arborist's report used calm, precise language, measurements, and diagrams. It documented trunk diameters, distances to the curb, soil stability, and crown spread. The photos showed my trees standing solidly with the mountain slope behind them, marked with small labels rather than angry red circles. The key paragraph sat toward the center of the report. It stated that the evergreens were mature, structurally sound, and presented no unreasonable or unmanageable risk to roadway access when combined with standard winter maintenance practices. It noted that tree needle shed was normal and predictable and suggested mitigations like selective branch pruning and adjusted plow paths rather than removal. One sentence specifically mentioned that removal could increase erosion risk on the curve, potentially making winter conditions worse, not better. Reading that, I felt something in me settle. This wasn't just my opinion versus the HOA's favorite vendor anymore. I had a professional assessment that did not rely on emotional language or convenience. It relied on facts. I knew better than to wave the report around only inside the boardroom where they could control the narrative. If this association liked anything, it was process. So I used process. I drafted a letter addressed to the board and the management company, referencing my lot number and the violation hearing date. I attached a copy of the arborist's report and asked that it be added to my file as a formal rebuttal to the landscaper's claims. I printed a second copy of the report to hand-deliver and kept the original in a labeled folder. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dining room window, lighting the edges of the pages as the printer hummed softly. In my letter, I stayed precise. I noted that the trees predated the 2018 guidelines. I highlighted the arborist's conclusion that removal was unnecessary and potentially harmful to the slope. I pointed out the conflict of interest inherent in relying solely on the landscaper whose winter work schedule would be made easier by erasing obstacles. I then referenced Clause 4.7 directly, quoting only the key concept in my own words, that the association could be responsible for reimbursing owners if their chosen vendor caused unnecessary damage or expense. I did not threaten legal action. I did not mention attorneys at all. Instead, I asked clear questions. If the board insisted on removal despite the arborist's opinion, would they accept liability for any resulting slope instability? Would they agree to reimburse me for the cost of the arborist's assessment if his mitigation recommendations were ignored? Would they document in writing why they rejected a neutral professional's findings in favor of their contractor's convenience? I also copied neighbors who lived on the same bend of the road. I had spoken quietly with them in the days after my hearing, sharing the broad strokes of what was happening. Some of them had their own worries about the landscaper prioritizing speed over care each winter. One neighbor mentioned a near miss the prior season when the plow pushed a berm of snow against her mailbox so hard it cracked the post. They were not surprised to learn my trees were the latest target. Within a week, whispers started circulating. People who had not attended my hearing asked me in passing how the tree situation was going. At the mailbox cluster, a resident I barely knew remarked that they had read parts of the arborist's report I had shared and found it interesting that the association had not requested one themselves before ordering removal. The air was turning colder again, the breath of every conversation visible in little white clouds, and the tension was no longer something confined to the pages of my violation notice. The board could ignore my feelings. They could brush past a single homeowner's complaints. But ignoring a written expert opinion while neighbors watched, knowing that Clause 4.7 could obligate them to reimburse for any damage their chosen vendor caused, put them in a different kind of risk category entirely. If they pushed forward anyway, they were not just bullying me. They were creating a written record of choosing convenience over due diligence, and that record could come back to haunt them in ways far messier than a pile of needles on the road. So I didn't threaten. I simply made sure that their next move would be made in daylight with witnesses. The board responded with a short, carefully crafted letter. They acknowledged receiving the arborist's report and stated that they were reviewing its contents. They stressed that their priority remained community safety and adherence to standards. They did not withdraw the violation yet, but they paused the daily fine schedule pending further review. It was a small hinge, but it meant the countdown they had used to pressure me had stopped ticking, at least temporarily. Then the winter newsletter arrived, the one that usually included warm season photos and reminders about storing hoses. This time, my situation appeared, not by name, but as a case study, in a section about balancing safety and property rights. The board described a scenario where mature trees near a curve raised snow management challenges and explained that they had obtained expert input to evaluate the risk. They made a point of saying that the association was committed to considering all relevant information, including third-party assessments, when making decisions. Reading between the lines, I could tell what had happened. My arborist report had forced them to reframe the story. They could no longer present my trees as a simple violation. They now had to acknowledge that there was a genuine question to be answered, not just a stubborn homeowner to be managed. The fluorescent light above my kitchen table buzzed softly as I traced the phrase, third-party assessments, with my finger. They had unintentionally admitted, in writing, that my report mattered. I attended the next open board meeting with a calm I did not have at the violation hearing. I brought the arborist's report, the final notice dated November 10, the agenda excerpt from my first hearing, and a fresh copy of Clause 4.7 tucked at the back. The room looked the same as before, the same tan walls and the same stackable chairs, but the atmosphere was different. More homeowners had shown up, some standing along the back wall, coats still on. The windows were dark, the cold outside pressing against the glass while the heater rattled to keep up. During the open comment period, I spoke plainly. I summarized the arborist's findings. I reminded the board that the trees had been in place for decades, long before the current landscape rules. I noted that removal was not only unnecessary but potentially harmful to the slope, according to an expert with no contract ties to the association. I pointed out that their own winter newsletter had mentioned third-party assessments, and that my report fit that category. Most importantly, without raising my voice, I asked the question I had been holding: if they authorized the landscaper to remove the trees against professional advice, and that action led to erosion, property damage, or unnecessary expense, would they commit in writing to reimbursing me under Clause 4.7? I did not say they had to answer that night. I simply requested that their decision, whatever it was, be documented for the record. Silence in a meeting can be more powerful than shouting. For a few seconds after I finished, the room felt like it was holding its breath. The board members looked at each other, and I watched the calculation happening behind their eyes. If they doubled down, they would not just be battling me. They would be publicly accepting responsibility for any fallout from a decision that their own newsletter and my arborist had now made look reckless. The tension was no longer about whether they could force me to remove trees. It was about whether they were willing to put their own association's finances and reputation on the line to prove they could. The president finally said they would take the matter under advisement and respond in writing. She did not repeat the word non-compliant. She did not mention $200 fines. Instead, she talked about careful review and balancing obligations. It wasn't an apology, but it was not the bulldozing tone they had used before either. A week later, the letter came. The envelope felt different even before I opened it, thicker, with a faint smell of toner and paper dust. Inside, the board's decision was laid out in numbered paragraphs, as if they wanted every step documented clearly. They began by acknowledging the arborist's report and its conclusion that removal of the trees was unnecessary and potentially harmful. They stated that, upon review, the trees would be considered existing non-conforming vegetation, predating current guidelines, effectively recognizing them as grandfathered. They then withdrew the removal order entirely. The violation was vacated. There would be no $200 daily fines, no association-initiated remediation. Instead, they set out a small list of conditions. I would agree to schedule selective pruning every few years, I would continue to clear the curb after storms, and the landscaper would adjust plow routes slightly on that curve, treating the area as a documented slope stabilization zone. At the end of the letter, in a paragraph that might have looked harmless to anyone glancing quickly, they wrote something that made me pause. They stated that, in light of the independent expert opinion and potential reimbursement implications under Clause 4.7, the board has elected not to pursue tree removal at this time. It was one sentence, but it said everything. They had seen the risk. They had weighed it against their desire for a neat plow path and decided it was not worth the fallout. My petty side savored that line. The same clause they had tucked away at the back of the binder, the one they probably assumed most owners would never read, had become the leverage that turned their threat into a retreat. This was not just a personal win. It was a precedent. If they tried something similar with another homeowner later, there would now be a written record showing that expert reports and Clause 4.7 could sway their decisions. The aftermath rippled quietly. At the next annual meeting, one of the agenda items was a vendor performance review. The board mentioned that they were evaluating the snow removal contract to ensure alignment with community expectations and best practices. They did not name names, but it was clear that the landscaper's influence had slipped. By the following season, another company's trucks were plowing the internal streets. The old vendor's logo disappeared from the newsletter. The sound of the new plows on cold mornings was different, a slightly higher pitch as they scraped past my curve and worked around the evergreens instead of glaring at them. Neighbors stopped me on walks to say they were glad the trees stayed. One admitted that seeing the board back down gave them courage to push back on a smaller issue about patio furniture that had always bothered them. Another joked that my trees had become famous, a quiet reminder that the association did not always get the last word. It was petty, and it was satisfying. The cost to me was not nothing. I had paid for the arborist's report. I had spent hours poring over covenants and writing letters. I had walked into meetings where the board held the microphones and the agenda. But I still had my view. I still had the line of evergreens catching snow on winter mornings, their branches heavy but steady, holding the slope together while plows rumbled past. And I had something else, too, proof that pushing back with information and patience could turn an HOA power play into a documented retreat. On the first real storm of the next winter, I stood at my upstairs window with a mug of coffee, watching the new plow company navigate the curve. The flakes were thick, drifting past the glass and coating the branches in white. The truck slowed slightly, adjusted its angle, and passed by without any drama. The curb collected its usual scattering of needles and snow, nothing more dangerous than it had ever been. The mountain air was crisp, the sky a soft, dim gray, and my evergreens stood where they belonged.